that you can look at two different schools of thought, that it is two types of sort of ancient beasts, or
Mm-hmm.
was two types of ancient beasts for a specific reason, or maybe it was part of the hierarchy. Some people believe that Leviathan is talking actually about Satan. And in the book of Isaiah, it talks about the Leviathan, the male Leviathan, will be killed in the end time.
Hmm.
Satan is dealt with in the end time, and he's a serpentine individual.
Hmm.
And when you look at polytheism, they always had a counter uh, female god with the male god. So, let's say in the Sumerian pantheon, you have Tiamat, which is a serpentine god that is Leviathan like, but a female. And in the Bible, the female is slain, right? And the male isn't, so that the
Hmm.
world isn't consumed by them. And in all the polytheist traditions, and there's many names for Tiamat. It can be Lotan, it can be Yam, Verita, and Indra. It's in all cultures all around the world. A god that is sort of usurping God's position. So Baal or Marduk, Indra, gods like that slay this female dragon because it's a god. It's one of the gods, and it's causing rebellion against the pantheon of the gods. So a god in the Bible destroys the multi-headed Leviathan, the female. So you get that sort of maybe consistency that may have been Satan's partner in that dualistic pantheon that polytheists have, that he would sit in the original time maybe at the head of the council of the gods with his female goddess.
Hmm.
So I look at that and I say, I can't say for certain that Leviathan is necessarily referring to Satan, but boy, you can make a pretty good case for it. That Leviathan in the end time, that
Hmm.
could that also be an prophetic allegory for the serpentine um, dragon empires, the beast empires, because you
Hmm.
have the conglomeration of the seven beast empires forming in the end time that's going to make the way for Antichrist to rise amongst them. And it has seven heads, right? It comes from the sea. It's it's called the dragon. It's called the red dragon in Revelation 12, and in Revelation 13 it's just a dragon. So you could make an argument that it might be that as well, or it might be both. It could be just sort of covering that all off in a sort of a summary allegory. The only one that we can say for certain without getting into speculation is that
Hmm.
Leviathan is reserved for a death in the end time. So if there is one, and if it is swimming in the sea, or it's just an allegory for Satan, I mean that will be dealt with. So, but
Hmm.
the thing that we also have to be aware of is you could have had people working with fallen angels not in the abyss or with demons to
Hmm.
recreate, as in the movies of Jurassic Park about recreation of these things, and maybe they've already been experimenting, and some of them are already. I mean, we don't know. But what
Hmm.
we do know is the entertainment industry is designed to tell us what they're doing and what they will be doing. It's important to distinguish the gods between the demigods. And everybody's
Hmm.
familiar with that through separations. Nobody says, well, why is there a separation? And demigod is the ancient understanding that is a lower level of God that's created specifically from a fallen angel or a god and a human female. So it's from the physical world, it has godlike characteristics, and at one time they were completely immortal in those bodies until until God took that away in Genesis 6:3 and limited all life to 120 years in the physical body. Um, so when we look at the power that the angels have, it's significant more by inference to what the giants would have, and that not all of those traits would have been passed on to the giants, but some were. So they
Hmm.
would have had some degree of additional, what we would call superpowers in the modern language,
Hmm.
superpowers of heroes, just as heroes were called a name for giants in Greek history and in Sumerian history. So when you have the story of Gilgamesh and the kings of Uruk, that's a story of the heroes of Uruk. There's separate literature on that as to the Epic of Gilgamesh, but it's talking about them as heroes. And so it was an understanding that those were giants, offspring of the gods and human meals. So Gilgamesh was the offspring of his father, Lugabanda, king of Uruk, and the fertility goddess named Nin, and in some translations, Ninsin. So definitely a Nephilim, Raphaim type of character. And he had great power. He could even take on the gods to the certain degree. You have written in the book of giants of Enoch, the one with just the fragments, the book of the giants, that Gilgamesh before the flood, there's two different Gilgameshes, one after and one before. Just as that's not unusual, Hercules is the same way. And we know that because I just told you who produced Gilgamesh after the flood. He's sixth generation after the flood, and yet we've got a giant that's talked about before the flood. And just as you have Zeus being the father of Hercules with alchemy, as opposed to Hercules, who is either a god or a giant, and likely both before the flood. And they usually conflate the two because people don't separate parent gods from offspring gods, and understand when they reigned. One's before the flood, the offspring gods like Baal, Anki, Osiris, Zeus, they're ruling after the flood. So you have to understand prehistory, you kind of have to keep that sort of straight. So these demigods had powers. They had the ability to self-heal, for example. And how I get there is through the post-diluvian giants, the Raphaim, that you have several different words that go back to the Hebrew word Rapha, starting with 7495, 7496, 7497, and then there's a couple of names of people named Rapha that they separate those into different people after those three. And 7497 is the one that is the translation for giant 25 times in the Bible. It's only translated twice as Raphaim, in Genesis 14 in the War of Giants, and in Genesis 15 when God is promising Abraham the land from the Nile to the Euphrates River that includes not only the mighty seven, which of course the Raphaim are included there, but there's a mighty 10, which I call the ancient KKK, the Cadmonim, the Kenazim, and the Kenim. So different rabbit hole, but so 7496 reflects them as their disembodied spirit, or Rapha, or Raphaim as a disembodied spirit. And that's like an evil spirit or a demonic spirit or a shade. It is also, so it's what happens to the giants after they die. And 7495 is the root word, which means to heal. And it's thought that they could heal themselves. You cut off their arm, they could grow an arm back. And the only way you could kill them was to take the head, to do it suddenly, just as Goliath did.
I was going to say that's
just as what happened to Goliath. Yeah, and several other times throughout the Bible, and I list them because they were hard to kill. They were ultimate warriors, and so they either did that through natural self-healing, like some animals in nature have that ability, like, or a talent or a gene or something that's passed on through the physical body and the DNA of their godfathers, that they could self-heal and regenerate and keep that body immortal until that was taken away. Or they had a technology that could repair themselves, as in a sarcophagus, as a lot of people speculate. What's interesting is you have the Ugaritic text, which is post-diluvian. It's talking about Baal and the Baalim of Mount Hermon. and the different tribes of the assembly of giants, the assembly of Datanu, which is the Ugaritic word for the Tuatha De Danann, or the tribe of Danu. And you have the Raphaim and the Raphaim, which is the root word for Hebrew Raphaim. And all would go back to the vowelless original of RPM, whether it's ancient Hebrew or ancient Semitic. And they're not only known as the dynastic warrior kings, which we understand warrior, the giants like Rapha, just as Goliath was a Raphaim. It was a giant, Rapha, just as his four brothers were, maybe five, depending on how you want to interpret that. And you have them also listed as travelers, just as we get the travelers in Ezekiel 39, the mighty ones at the time of the end time Gog war, which goes back to the Hebrew word abar, which means to cross over. And as it's used in the book of Job and other passages, and Dr. Heiser used to talk about this, as I recall, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, a bar can be used in 1,000 different ways, but when it's grouped with death, it's usually meaning pass over. And these are the travelers that are showing up in Ezekiel 39. And what's interesting about that is with the Ugaritic text, these travelers, they had the ability, when a giant king died, to do the death ritual and to lead a ritual parade into the underworld, so that they made it there safely. And or at times they could enter into the underworld and through the portal, and into where the gods were living in their belief system. And so they had the power to do that as well. And so they were like these travelers. So they're giant kings or travelers. And it says in the Ugaritic text that they had the ability to heal themselves and to heal others. So when you get this Fisher King concept that sort of passes down, or with the Merovingian shepherd kings and things like that, these are demigod, as they're entitling themselves with the divine right to rule, who had special powers, including healing. That's the tradition that is being represented in that sort of imagery. So they had the power to do that. So the other question is what else could they do?